A brief engagement near Avdiivka resulted in the destruction of at least 2 Russian armored vehicles, the disabling of a tank, and several Russian infantry elements being pinned down in exposed terrain. On its own, this was not a major offensive, and it did not change the front line. But the encounter matters for a different reason. It offers a clear look at how the fight on the Donetsk front is evolving. Ukrainian units are no longer focused only on holding ground or trading fire. Instead, they are increasingly using fast, mobile strikes, hit hard, pull back before pressure builds, then return again before the opposing force can reorganize. Around Avdiivka, elements of Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade used Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in a sequence of actions that appeared risky at first glance, but were tightly coordinated and carefully timed. The story here is not simply about destroyed vehicles. What matters more is how Ukrainian forces combined reconnaissance, armor, infantry, and drones to force Russian units into a reactive posture. Despite Russia still having artillery support and larger troop numbers available, each Russian response came late and at a higher cost than expected. If this pattern continues, Avdiivka may become a clear example of how the Donetsk front is being worn down incrementally, not shattered by a single breakthrough. That leads to an uncomfortable question. Was this just one isolated clash, or is it an early sign of a new way of fighting taking hold? Avdiivka remains a strategic flashpoint because its location turns every local engagement into a pressure test for both sides. The city sits directly next to Donetsk, where front lines press against dense urban and industrial terrain. Any movement here carries weight far beyond a single trench or village. For Russian forces, Avdiivka is more than another objective on the map. Gaining control around the city could reduce artillery pressure on Donetsk and help shield rear areas from constant fire. Holding ground here shortens supply routes, stabilizes nearby positions, and allows Moscow to claim progress near one of the region's most politically sensitive cities. Ukrainian measures Avdiivka's value differently. Instead of treating it as terrain that must be held at any cost, Ukrainian planners increasingly see it as a space where Russian advances can be slowed, redirected, and made expensive through short, controlled engagements. This helps explain why intense fighting continues even when neither side launches a full-scale offensive. The terrain reinforces this logic. Avdiivka is surrounded by industrial ruins, tree lines, trench networks, and open approaches that limit large formations but reward units that can move quickly and react faster. Sheer numbers matter less here. Timing, coordination, and control of short distances matter more. For Russian units, pressure to keep moving is constant. Pausing leaves them exposed to observation and indirect fire. But pushing too hard risks entering prepared engagement zones where armored vehicles and infantry are already tracked. That creates a narrow window for effective action, and missing it often leads to losses that are difficult to recover or conceal. Ukrainian forces have adapted by focusing less on static defense and more on shaping Russian behavior. Instead of blocking every advance, they aim to force Russian commanders into repeated decisions that burn time, equipment, and momentum. Every probe or reinforcement attempt becomes a moment of risk rather than progress. This approach does not require holding every position overnight. It requires awareness, rapid deployment, and the discipline to disengage once objectives are met. Avdiivka provides the terrain and density to support this style of fighting, which is why it remains contested after years of combat. The result is a front line that rarely goes quiet but also rarely shifts dramatically. Pressure builds through repeated encounters where one side takes losses simply by trying to move. That is why small clashes around Avdiivka often carry outsized meaning. The approach phase of this engagement shows how battles are shaped before the first direct contact. Ukrainian units did not advance blindly or rely on speed alone. The movement was preceded by drone reconnaissance watching roads, tree lines, and likely firing positions well in advance. This constant observation allowed Ukrainian commanders to track when Russian artillery was active, when it paused, and when targeting data was incomplete. The decision to move came during a narrow window when Russian guns were alert but not yet locked onto precise coordinates. Once the Bradleys began moving, their advance was controlled rather than rushed. Vehicles stayed under cover as long as possible, using terrain and structures to limit exposure. This shortened the time Russian observers had to confirm targets and pass corrections to artillery units. At the drop-off point, infantry dismounted immediately. There was no clustering and no hesitation. Teams spread out in multiple directions, each with a clear task and a short distance to cover. That speed reduced vulnerability to incoming fire. Russian artillery reacted quickly, but the response was scattered. Rounds landed across open ground and empty areas rather than precise dismount locations. The fire was loud and threatening, but tactically limited, suggesting it was based on general movement cues rather than real-time targeting. Those first seconds mattered. Ukrainian infantry continued moving instead of freezing. Smoke and noise from the impacts were used as temporary cover to close distance toward trenches and firing positions. Every step forward reduced the value of delayed artillery adjustments. From the Russian side, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Once Ukrainian teams reached covered positions, adjusting fire risked hitting friendly forces or wasting ammunition. The chance to stop the action cleanly had already passed. This phase shows how modern engagements are often decided before the main exchange of fire. Control of observation and timing can turn even heavy firepower into a blunt instrument. The direct clash phase exposed serious problems for Russian armored units once the fight moved into close range. As Ukrainian infantry settled forward, Russian commanders rushed reinforcements towards the contact zone. Two BTR-82A armored personnel carriers advanced quickly along a direct route. The emphasis was on speed, not protection. That choice limited flexibility and left little room to react once committed. Bradley crews detected the movement early. At close range, maneuver was unnecessary. Direct fire was applied with precision. The first BTR was hit and stopped almost immediately. Flames and smoke marked the impact, and momentum vanished within seconds. The second BTR followed the same path and suffered the same fate. Before its crew could deploy infantry or react, it was struck and disabled. What was meant to reinforce the line collapsed into vehicle losses within moments. Russian infantry spilled into open ground, suddenly without armored protection. Movement shifted from coordination to survival, sharply reducing any chance of organized follow-on action. Along a nearby axis, another Bradley identified an armored target at close range. An anti-tank missile was launched, destroying the vehicle before it could reposition. Before we move on, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Producing accurate reporting and confirming real battlefield events takes time, research, and careful review. Your support allows us to continue. Let's return to the video. Additional Russian fighting vehicles were engaged with direct fire, and at least one BMP was destroyed. What made this phase decisive was not volume of fire, but sequence. Russian armor entered the fight after Ukraine already held awareness and favorable angles. Speed turned into vulnerability. The withdrawal phase revealed a key difference in tactical thinking. After achieving immediate objectives, Ukrainian units did not try to hold ground indefinitely. Disengagement was treated as an active phase, not a retreat. Bradleys maintained controlled fire to limit Russian pursuit, while Ukrainian infantry pulled back in stages. Spacing and direction remained under command, reducing confusion under pressure. Russian forces attempted to disrupt the withdrawal with missiles and indirect fire. One Bradley maneuvered sharply to evade a missile threat, then shifted position again as mortar rounds landed nearby. These were trained responses, not panic reactions. Another Bradley took multiple hits and lost mobility. The crew remained protected, and a third vehicle moved in to extract personnel under cover. The vehicle was damaged, but trained soldiers were preserved. This matters. Equipment can be replaced, crews cannot. Throughout the disengagement, Ukrainian fire focused on denial, not destruction. The goal was to buy time, then fade out before Russian forces could coordinate an effective response. The pressure phase followed quickly. Withdrawal was not a pause, it was a reset. Bradleys returned alongside Abrams tanks, forming mobile, protected formations. FPV drones monitored roads and open ground ahead. Drones guided fire or struck directly, forcing hesitation. That hesitation mattered. Every delay increased exposure. Russian commanders had to choose between moving and being seen or staying still and being mapped. Ukrainian armor advanced just far enough to threaten key routes, then shifted again. Fire was selective. The goal was not to seize ground, but to deny safe movement. This approach avoided escalation while keeping Russian units under constant strain. Concentrating forces increased detection risk. Dispersing reduced combat power. In the end, the fighting near Avdiivka did not redraw the map, but it revealed a shift in how Ukraine is fighting on the Donetsk front. Fast strikes, controlled withdrawal, return pressure before recovery. Time has become a weapon. Every Russian response arrives later, costs more, and solves fewer problems. If this pattern continues, battles here may be decided not by large offensives, but by who controls tempo and choice. At the core of these sudden engagements is a simple reality. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war for its own survival, and that shapes how, where, and why it fights. Ukrainian forces are not advancing to capture distant territory or to score symbolic victories. They are defending their cities, their infrastructure, and their population centers against a larger force that relies heavily on mass, artillery, and pressure. This creates a different mindset. Ukrainian units cannot afford long, grinding battles that trade manpower for meters of ground. Instead, they are forced to fight smarter, faster, and with tighter control over risk. That is why sudden attacks near places like Avdiivka are not accidents or improvisation. They are deliberate attempts to break Russian momentum before it can fully form. Russian losses in these encounters often spike not because Ukrainian firepower is overwhelming, but because Russian units are pushed to move under time pressure. When Russian commanders are ordered to advance, reinforce, or probe quickly, they often do so before coordination is complete. That creates openings. Ukrainian units exploit those openings with early detection, drones, and prepared engagement zones. Once Russian units commit, pulling back becomes difficult, and mistakes compound rapidly. Ukrainian success in these attacks also comes from defensive motivation. Soldiers fighting for their own territory tend to prioritize survival, coordination, and adaptability over rigid orders. Ukrainian units are encouraged to disengage when conditions turn unfavorable, preserve forces, and strike again later. This flexibility contrasts with Russian units that are often tasked with holding or taking ground regardless of cost. As a result, Russian forces absorb losses during sudden attacks because they are reacting rather than shaping the fight. Ukrainian units choose when to appear, when to disappear, and when to reapply pressure. That control of tempo matters more than numerical advantage. Over time, repeated small losses wear down morale, equipment, and confidence. Vehicles are destroyed not in massive battles, but in moments when movement is exposed and decisions are rushed. Infantry losses mount when armored support fails at critical moments. Ukraine wins these encounters not because every attack succeeds, but because failure does not cascade. Losses are contained, crews are recovered, and units reset quickly. Russia, meanwhile, is forced to spend more resources just to maintain pressure. This imbalance is why sudden attacks near Avdiivka carry outsized impact. They reflect a defensive force using speed, intelligence, and restraint to survive, and slowly exhaust a larger opponent without needing a single decisive breakthrough.